Frances Ellen Watkins Harper was a pioneering voice for justice who became one of the most influential African American writers and activists of the 19th century. Frances Harper, a poet, novelist, lecturer, and reformer, was born free in Baltimore, Maryland on September 24, 1825. She came from humble beginnings but possessed extraordinary talent. Harper had a dignified presence and commanding oratorical skills. Her intellectual achievements were remarkable. She was educated at her uncle's academy for free black children until the age of 13, when she left school to work as a domestic servant. Then in 1850, her uncle William Watkins, an influential abolitionist and educator, helped shape her worldview. The young Harper inherited a legacy of activism and a commitment to social justice that would define her entire life. Frances Harper was witness to the brutality of slavery. She saw the auction blocks and the suffering of enslaved people in Baltimore, a city on the border between freedom and bondage. In 1850, when Maryland passed a law that threatened free black people with enslavement if they entered the state, Harper, who had been teaching in Ohio, found herself unable to return to her birthplace. She was driven from her home by unjust laws. Harper began her career as a teacher in Ohio and Pennsylvania. She taught at Union Seminary near Columbus and later in Pennsylvania. After Maryland's oppressive legislation made her an exile from her native state, she sought a position that would allow her to fight against slavery more directly. She was transformed by the injustice she witnessed. In 1853, Harper published her first collection of poetry, and within a year she had become a traveling lecturer for the Maine Anti-Slavery Society. Harper was not a passive observer or a quiet voice in the movement. She was a fierce advocate who traveled throughout the northern states delivering passionate speeches against slavery and for women's rights. She was a more committed radical than many of her contemporaries. In September 1854, Harper delivered her first major lecture, and within months she had become one of the most sought-after speakers on the abolitionist circuit. Harper was literally the woman who traveled from town to town, from church to church, ready to challenge the conscience of the nation. In 1860, Harper's reputation as a speaker and writer had grown immensely. She had published multiple poetry collections and her work was widely read in abolitionist circles. But as the nation moved towards civil war, Harper intensified her efforts. Frances Harper spoke battle after battle in the court of public opinion, and she never retreated from her principles. She always lived to fight for justice another day. In the years leading up to the Civil War, Harper traveled constantly. Frances Harper was a tireless warrior when she crossed state lines to speak in hostile territories. She was using the power of words and moral persuasion to awaken consciences, and no one was expecting the impact she would have. Harper's poetry resonated with audiences across racial lines. Her verses were published in abolitionist newspapers and read at anti-slavery meetings. Following the publication of her most famous poems was a period of intense activism for Harper. The pre-war years were a crucial time. That turbulent period they were fighting for freedom with words and deeds. Harper's strategy was all about reaching hearts and minds and making people confront the evil of slavery for another generation. The Civil War began in April 1861, and Harper continued her work throughout the conflict. With the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, the war's purpose was clarified, and Harper saw her life's work beginning to bear fruit. In 1865, with the war over and slavery abolished, Harper did not go home to rest. Harper was pulled back into the political struggle, back into the work of Reconstruction where the nation was attempting to carve out a new social order, and she agreed to continue her activism to help unify and uplift the newly freed people. On November 22, 1860, Frances Harper married Fenton Harper, a widower with 3 children. Frances Harper was one of the few prominent activists who managed to balance marriage and motherhood with her public work. Harper lived on a farm in Ohio with her husband and raised their daughter Mary. She continued to write during this period, though her speaking engagements were reduced. When her husband died in 1864, leaving her in difficult financial circumstances, Harper returned to the lecture circuit with renewed determination. After the Civil War, Harper traveled throughout the South, speaking to newly freed African Americans about education, temperance, and moral uplift. She understood that for the formerly enslaved to truly achieve freedom and for there to be real equality and not just legal emancipation, there had to be education, economic opportunity, and political power. She had to set the example of the activist who continues the struggle even after the immediate goal is achieved. Harper spent years traveling through southern states, often under difficult and dangerous conditions. In 1866, Harper delivered speeches in 11 states. She spoke at churches, schools, and public halls. Her message was one of hope but also of hard work and self-determination. Harper believed deeply in the capacity of African Americans to rise and prosper if given the opportunity. She also believed in the importance of women's rights and became increasingly involved in the women's suffrage movement. Harper was a bridge between the abolitionist movement and the emerging movements for civil rights and women's equality. Frances Harper understood intersectionality before the term existed. She recognized that the struggles of Black Americans and women were interconnected. She spoke eloquently about the double burden faced by Black women who suffered discrimination based on both race and gender. In 1866, at the National Women's Rights Convention, Harper delivered a powerful speech titled "We Are All Bound Up Together," in which she articulated this vision of interconnected struggles. She challenged white feminists to consider the specific challenges faced by Black women. Harper's activism was not limited to speeches. She was a prolific writer throughout her life. Her poetry collection sold thousands of copies, making her one of the best-selling African American poets of the 19th century. Her most famous poem, "Bury Me in a Free Land," expressed her anguish over slavery and her determination never to rest in a land where people were enslaved. The poem was widely reprinted and became an anthem for the abolitionist cause. Harper also wrote short stories and essays that appeared in newspapers and magazines throughout the country. In 1869, Harper attended the American Equal Rights Association meeting where the movement split over the question of whether to support the 15th Amendment, which would grant voting rights to Black men but not to women. Harper sided with those who supported the amendment, arguing that Black men's enfranchisement was urgently needed and that women's suffrage could be pursued alongside it. This position put her at odds with some white feminists, including Susan B. A. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who opposed the amendment because it did not include women. Harper's position reflected her understanding that for Black communities, the immediate need for political power was paramount. Harper continued her activism through the 1870s and 1880s. She joined the Women's Christian Temperance Union and became superintendent of its colored section. She traveled extensively, speaking about temperance, which she saw as a moral and social issue that particularly affected Black communities. Harper believed that alcohol abuse contributed to poverty and domestic violence, and she saw temperance as part of a broader program of moral and social uplift. Her work with the WCTU brought her into contact with white reformers, and she consistently challenged them to address racial prejudice within their own ranks. In 1892, at the age of 67, Harper published her most ambitious work, the novel Iola Lee Roy, or Shadows Uplifted. The novel told the story of a light-skinned Black woman who discovers her African American heritage and chooses to identify with and work for the uplift of Black people. The novel was groundbreaking in its portrayal of Black characters as intelligent, moral, and capable. It challenged the racist stereotypes that dominated American literature at the time. Iola Lee Roy was one of the first novels published by an African American woman, and it sold well, reaching both Black and white audiences. The novel's heroine, Iola Lee Roy, embodied many of Harper's own values. She was educated, principled, and committed to racial uplift. She rejected the opportunity to pass as white and instead chose to work as a teacher and activist in Black communities. Through Iola's story, Harper explored themes of identity, racial pride, and social responsibility. The novel also addressed the sexual exploitation of enslaved women and the complex family relationships that resulted from slavery's legacy. Harper used fiction to educate readers about the realities of slavery and its aftermath. Harper's literary style was accessible and moralistic. She wrote to instruct and inspire rather than simply to entertain. Her poetry often employed simple rhyme schemes and straightforward language, making it easy to memorize and recite. This accessibility was deliberate. Harper wanted her work to reach ordinary people, not just educated elites. Her poems were read aloud at meetings and gatherings, and they were effective tools for spreading abolitionist and reform messages. Harper understood the power of literature as a vehicle for social change. Throughout the 1890s and into the early 20th century, Harper remained active despite advancing age. She continued to write and speak, though less frequently than in her younger years. She was involved in the founding of the National Association of Colored Women in 1896 and served as a vice president of the organization. The NACW brought together black women's clubs from across the country to work for racial uplift, education, and social reform. Harper's involvement reflected her lifelong commitment to organized activism and her belief in the power of black women to effect change. Harper also remained involved in the struggle for women's suffrage. She attended suffrage conventions and continued to advocate for voting rights for all women. She challenged the racism within the suffrage movement and insisted that black women's voices be heard. Harper understood that political power was essential for achieving social change, and she worked to ensure that black women would be included in the expansion of democratic rights. Her persistence in the face of discrimination from white suffragists demonstrated her commitment to both racial and gender justice. In her later years, Harper lived in Philadelphia, where she had settled after the Civil War. She remained intellectually active, writing poetry and essays and corresponding with other reformers. She was respected as an elder stateswoman of the reform movements, and younger activists sought her counsel and support. Harper had witnessed tremendous change in her lifetime, from the height of slavery to its abolition, from the complete disenfranchisement of black Americans to the promise of citizenship rights, from the exclusion of women from public life to the emergence of a powerful women's movement. Harper's personal life was marked by both joy and sorrow. She had a close relationship with her daughter Mary, who survived to adulthood and married. Harper also maintained friendships with other activists and writers, including William Still, the noted conductor on the Underground Railroad, and other prominent figures in the abolitionist and reform movements. She corresponded with Frederick Douglass and other leaders of the black community. These relationships sustained her through decades of demanding work and provided networks of support for her activism. Harper's religious faith was central to her identity and her activism. She was a devout Christian who saw her reform work as a religious calling. Her poetry and speeches frequently invoke biblical themes and language. She believed that Christianity, properly understood, demanded social justice and equality. She challenged Christians who supported slavery or discrimination, arguing that they had betrayed the fundamental teachings of their faith. Harper's religious conviction gave her strength and moral authority in her advocacy. Harper's economic philosophy emphasized self-help and mutual aid within black communities. She believed that African Americans needed to develop their own economic institutions and support black-owned businesses. She encouraged thrift, hard work, and education as paths to economic advancement. At the same time, she recognized that systemic racism created barriers to black economic progress, and she advocated for government policies that would provide support and opportunity. Harper's economic views reflected the complex reality of black life in post-emancipation America. Harper was also concerned with issues of health and hygiene in black communities. She spoke about the importance of sanitation, proper nutrition, and access to medical care. She recognized that poverty and discrimination contributed to poor health outcomes, and she worked to educate communities about practices that could improve health. This aspect of her activism reflected the broad scope of her concern for black welfare and her understanding that uplift required attention to all aspects of life. Harper's legacy as a writer has been increasingly recognized in recent decades. Literary scholars have rediscovered her work and placed it in the canon of American literature. Her novel Iola Leroy is now widely taught in universities, and her poetry is anthologized in collections of African American and women's literature. Scholars have analyzed her use of language, her narrative strategies, and her engagement with the literary conventions of her time. Harper is now recognized as a pioneering figure in African American literature and a significant voice in 19th-century American letters. Harper's activism also left a lasting legacy. She helped establish patterns of organizing and advocacy that would be continued by later generations of black activists. Her work with women's clubs presaged the club movement that would become so important in black communities in the early 20th century. Her insistence on addressing both racial and gender discrimination anticipated the intersectional approaches of later feminists. Harper's example of lifelong commitment to justice inspired countless others to take up the struggle. On February 22, 1911, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper died in Philadelphia at the age of 85. She had lived through the most transformative period in American history, from slavery to freedom, from exclusion to the promise of citizenship. When she died, she left behind a body of work that testified to her talent and her commitment. She left a legacy of activism that had touched thousands of lives. Harper was eulogized as a pioneer and a prophet, a woman who had dedicated her life to the cause of justice. Harper's funeral was attended by prominent members of Philadelphia's black community and by representatives of the various reform organizations with which she had been associated. Tributes poured in from across the country, recognizing her contributions to literature and reform. Newspapers published obituaries that celebrated her achievements and mourned her passing. The outpouring of grief and respect demonstrated the impact she had had on her contemporaries. Frances Harper's life spanned a period of tremendous change in American society. She was born into a nation where slavery was legal and where free black people faced severe restrictions on their rights and opportunities. She died in a nation where slavery had been abolished and where black Americans, though still facing discrimination and violence, had achieved citizenship and the vote. Harper had been a witness to this transformation, but more than that, she had been an agent of change. Through her writing and her activism, she had helped to bring about the world she envisioned. Harper's intersectional approach to activism set her apart from many of her contemporaries. While some activists focused exclusively on racial justice or on women's rights, Harper understood that these struggles were interconnected. She recognized that black women faced unique challenges and that their liberation required attention to both race and gender. This insight made her a more effective advocate and a more inclusive leader. Her ability to build coalitions across different reform movements demonstrated her political skill and her commitment to comprehensive social change. Harper's literary achievements were remarkable for her time. As an African American woman in the 19th century, she faced enormous barriers to publication and recognition. Yet she managed to publish numerous books of poetry, a novel, short stories, and essays. Her work reached a wide audience and influenced public opinion on the crucial issues of her day. Harper proved that black women could be successful writers and intellectuals, challenging the racist and sexist assumptions of her society. Harper's speaking career was equally impressive. She traveled thousands of miles, often under difficult conditions, to deliver her message. She spoke to audiences large and small, in churches, schools, and public halls. Her oratorical skills were widely praised, and she was known for her ability to move audiences to tears and to action. Harper's speeches combined moral passion with careful argument, emotional appeal with factual evidence. She was a master of rhetoric who used her gifts to advance the cause of justice. Harper's commitment to education reflected her belief in the transformative power of knowledge. She had been fortunate to receive an education at her uncle's academy, and she understood how education had opened opportunities for her. She worked throughout her life to expand educational opportunities for black Americans, teaching in schools, advocating for public education, and encouraging young people to pursue learning. Harper believed that education was essential for individual advancement and for the progress of the race as a whole. Harper's temperance advocacy, while sometimes viewed critically by modern scholars, reflected her concern for the welfare of black families and communities. She saw alcohol abuse as a contributor to poverty, domestic violence, and social disorder. Her work with the temperance movement brought her into contact with reform networks that she used to advance other causes as well. Harper's temperance advocacy was part of her broader vision of moral and social uplift, a vision that emphasized personal responsibility alongside social reform. Harper's relationship with white reformers was complex. She worked alongside white abolitionists and suffragists, but she also challenged their racism and insisted on equal treatment. She refused to be patronized or to accept a subordinate role in reform movements. Harper's dignity and self-respect commanded respect from her white colleagues, even when they disagreed with her. Her ability to work across racial lines while maintaining her principles demonstrated her political acumen and her strength of character. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper was even in death a unifying figure, a woman who had bridged divides and brought people together in common cause. Her life's work had been dedicated to creating a more just and equal society, and she had made significant progress toward that goal. Though the full realization of her vision would require the work of many more generations, Harper had laid important groundwork and had inspired countless others to continue the struggle. Her legacy endures in the ongoing movements for racial and gender justice, in the literature she created, and in the example she set of a life dedicated to principle and to service.